Chapter 1. The Son of Yako. The dusty winds of the Sahel were a constant companion in Yako, a small town nestled in the heart of Upper Volta. They carried the scent of dry earth, the faint bleating of goats, and the whispers of a history both ancient and brutally recent. It was into this landscape, on December 21, 1949, that Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara was born, a child who would one day shake the foundations of his nation and challenge the prevailing order of a continent. Yako, like much of Upper Volta, bore the indelible scars of French colonialism. Though independence had been declared in 1960, the phantom limb of imperial control still throbbed with a dull ache. The administrative structures, the economic dependencies, and even the mentalities instilled by decades of foreign rule persisted. For the average Burkinabe, life was a struggle against pervasive poverty, widespread illiteracy, and a deep-seated feeling of powerlessness. Subsistence farming was the norm, where meager harvests often meant the difference between survival and starvation. Access to health care was a luxury few could afford, and the grand promises of independence often felt like a cruel joke, a distant echo that brought no tangible change to their daily toil. Sankara's father, Joseph Sankara, was a gendarme, a low-ranking officer in the colonial and then post-colonial police force. This profession, while offering a semblance of stability in a volatile land, also placed the family squarely within the machinery of the state, exposing young Thomas to its inherent contradictions from a tender age. He witnessed firsthand the arbitrary nature of authority, the stark divide between those who commanded and those who obeyed, and the subtle yet pervasive injustices woven into the fabric of daily life. The police force, even under African leadership, often served as an extension of the colonial power structure, tasked with maintaining an order that frequently benefited the privileged few over the disenfranchised many. Thomas saw villagers exploited, land disputes settled unfairly, and a system that seemed designed to keep the ordinary person in their place, subservient and voiceless. These observations, though perhaps not fully articulated by a child, began to etch themselves onto his consciousness, forming the bedrock of his future revolutionary zeal. He learned early that the law was not always just, and that power, unchecked, could be a tool of oppression. His mother, Marguerite, a devout Catholic, instilled in him a strong moral compass and an unwavering sense of duty. It was her influence, coupled with the family's modest but stable background, that led him to receive a Catholic education. This was no small matter in Upper Volta, where educational opportunities were scarce and often reserved for the elite or those with connections. The local primary school, run by missionaries, offered not just academic instruction, but also a rigorous discipline that shaped his formative years. The emphasis on morality, self-sacrifice, and serving a higher purpose resonated deeply with young Thomas. He was a bright and inquisitive student, quick to grasp concepts and eager to engage in discussions, often challenging his teachers with probing questions that went beyond the rote memorization encouraged by the curriculum. His reports often noted his intelligence and his capacity for deep thought, but also a burgeoning independence of mind. But beyond the textbooks and catechisms, it was on the dusty playing fields and in the crowded classrooms that Sankara's early spark of leadership began to flicker, almost imperceptibly at first. He wasn't just a quiet observer. He was a natural organizer, the one who rallied his friends for games, mediated disputes with surprising wisdom, and often articulated the unspoken frustrations of his peers. There were stories, told by those who knew him then, of his fierce sense of fairness, his unwavering unwillingness to tolerate bullying, and his surprisingly articulate arguments even at a young age. He wasn't a firebrand yet, not the charismatic orator who would one day captivate international audiences, but the embers were unmistakably there, a nascent understanding that the world was not as it should be, and a quiet yet firm determination to perhaps, one day, do something about it. The strictures of Catholic discipline, rather than stifling his spirited independence, seemed to channel it, providing a framework for his burgeoning sense of purpose. It taught him the value of principles, the power of conviction, and the importance of speaking truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Even then, amidst the lessons of scripture and arithmetic, Thomas Sankara was already looking beyond the walls of his classroom, observing the inequalities of his world, and beginning to dream of a different future for the land of Yako. Chapter 2. From Cadet to Captain. The path from the Catholic primary school in Yako to the military academy in Ouagadougou might seem an abrupt departure, yet for a bright young man in Upper Volta in the late 1960s, it was a logical, almost inevitable trajectory. Opportunities for upward mobility were scarce. The civil service was limited, the economy stagnant. The military, on the other hand, offered a rare avenue for education, a steady salary, and a chance to escape the grinding poverty that was the norm for so many of his peers. For Thomas Sankara, it was not merely a pragmatic choice. It was an entry point into a world of structured discipline, intellectual growth, and a profound, if then unarticulated, desire to serve his nation. In 1966, at the age of 16, he enrolled in the Prytanée Militaire de Kadiogo (PMK), a military preparatory school in the capital, marking the true beginning of his transformation from a disciplined student to a disciplined soldier. The PMK was an elite institution, designed to groom the future leadership of Upper Volta's armed forces. Here, the rigorous academic curriculum was paired with strict military training. Sankara excelled in both. His intelligence, noted by his early teachers, now found a new arena. He devoured books, not just those assigned, but anything he could get his hands on: history, philosophy, political theory. His sharp intellect and questioning nature quickly set him apart, and he was known for engaging his instructors in debates that often pushed the boundaries of conventional military thinking. He was a natural athlete, excelling in sports, which further built his physical prowess and leadership qualities among his fellow cadets. The discipline he learned from his Catholic upbringing dovetailed perfectly with the military's demanding regimen, fostering in him an unwavering commitment to duty and precision. It was after his foundational training at PMK that Sankara's journey took a pivotal turn. In 1970, he was selected for officer training abroad, a rare and prestigious opportunity. His destination was the Military Academy of Antold in Madagascar. This island nation, then a nascent republic grappling with its own post-colonial identity, proved to be an intellectual crucible for the young Upper Voltan cadet. Madagascar in the early 1970s was a hotbed of intellectual ferment and burgeoning political consciousness. The long shadow of French influence was still present, but the air vibrated with discussions of self-determination, socialist alternatives to capitalism, and the failures of traditional governance models. While military curricula typically focused on tactics and strategy, Antold offered something more. Sankara arrived at a time when the academy was not merely a training ground for soldiers, but a hub where revolutionary ideas took root. He encountered professors and fellow students who openly discussed leftist ideology, ranging from Marxism to various forms of African socialism. These were not abstract theories for him. They were frameworks for understanding the poverty and injustice he had witnessed back home. He read widely, delving into the works of Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, and Amilcar Cabral, figures who advocated for radical transformation, armed struggle, and the liberation of oppressed peoples from colonial and neo-colonial chains. The concept of neocolonialism, the idea that newly independent nations remained economically and politically subservient to former colonial powers, resonated deeply with his own observations of Upper Volta. Beyond the classroom, Sankara immersed himself in the vibrant Malagasy society. He observed the struggles of the Malagasy people, their rich cultural traditions, and their own efforts to forge a truly independent path. The spirit of revolution was palpable, culminating in the 1972 uprising that overthrew President Philibert Tsiranana, a pro-French leader, and brought about a more nationalist government. Witnessing this popular mobilization, the power of collective action, and the ability of ordinary people to effect profound political change was a revelation for Sankara. It transformed abstract theories into lived experience, demonstrating that liberation was not just a distant dream but a tangible possibility. His time in Madagascar solidified his belief that the military could be an instrument not just of state control, but of popular liberation. He began to envision an army that served the people, not just the ruling elite. The transition from a disciplined cadet to a thinking, politically aware officer was complete. When he returned to Upper Volta in 1972, now a commissioned officer, he carried with him not just military expertise but a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer merely Thomas Sankara, the son of a gendarme from Yako. He was Captain Sankara, a young man imbued with revolutionary ideas, eager to apply the lessons of Madagascar to the nascent struggles of his own nation. The seeds of a revolution had been sown, and they would soon begin to sprout in the fertile yet challenging soil of Upper Volta. Chapter 3. Awakening the Fire. Upon his return to Upper Volta in 1972, Captain Thomas Sankara was not the same young man who had left for Madagascar. He carried with him not just the crisp uniform and disciplined bearing of a commissioned officer, but a mind alight with radical ideas and a heart increasingly restless with the status quo. The intellectual ferment of Antold had catalyzed his latent political consciousness, transforming his youthful observations of injustice into a coherent critique of the systemic failures plaguing his homeland. This was the period where the fire truly began to awaken within him. Upper Volta was, by 1972, a nation adrift. The euphoria of independence had long since dissipated, replaced by a grim reality of political instability, economic stagnation, and pervasive corruption. Successive governments, often military-led, proved incapable or unwilling to address the fundamental issues facing the vast majority of Burkina Faso. Elites enriched themselves while the populace languished. The influence of France remained significant, pulling economic and political strings that further hampered genuine self-determination. For Sankara, these were not abstract problems. They were the very conditions he had sought to understand and now felt compelled to change. His military training had taught him how to lead and organize. His political awakening provided him with the why. Within the ranks of the Upper Voltan army, Sankara quickly gravitated towards a small but growing circle of like-minded officers. These were men who shared his disillusionment with the country's direction, and his conviction that the military could and should be an instrument of positive social change, not merely a tool for maintaining an oppressive order. Among them was Blaise Compaoré, a fellow officer who had become both his closest ally and, ultimately, his most devastating betrayer. In those early days, however, Compaoré, along with Henri Zongo and Jean-Baptiste Bukari-Lingani, formed the nucleus of a burgeoning reformist, even revolutionary faction within the armed forces. They were young, idealistic, and deeply frustrated by the inertia of the military establishment and the civilian governments it propped up. Their dissent was not overt at first. It manifested in late-night discussions, clandestine study groups where they dissected the works of revolutionary thinkers and debated the applicability of socialist theories to the unique context of Upper Volta. They analyzed the failures of African leaders, the mechanisms of neo-colonial control, and the potential for a popular uprising. Sankara, with his sharp analytical mind and burgeoning oratorical skills, often led these discussions, articulating the group's frustrations and charting potential pathways for change. He was not afraid to challenge established hierarchies or question long-held assumptions within the military. This intellectual boldness, combined with his undeniable charisma, made him a natural leader among his peers. Their involvement extended beyond theoretical discussions. They began to forge informal ties with radical civilian groups, student movements, trade unionists, and nascent intellectual circles who also harbored dreams of a more just Upper Volta. These alliances were crucial, as they provided Sankara and his comrades with a deeper understanding of the struggles faced by ordinary citizens and a broader base of support beyond the barracks. They organized clandestine meetings, distributed pamphlets, and began to articulate a vision for a truly independent and equitable Upper Volta. This nascent network was a quiet rebellion, a slow burn of revolutionary fervor simmering beneath the surface of official calm. The first significant test of Sankara's growing political consciousness and his willingness to challenge authority came with the 1974 Agadir Strip War with neighboring Mali. While many saw it as a conventional border conflict, Sankara, who distinguished himself militarily with his courage and tactical acumen, viewed it through a different lens. He saw it as a senseless conflict, distracting from the real enemies of poverty and underdevelopment, and manipulated by external powers. He famously refused to use certain Western-supplied artillery, arguing that they were irrelevant to the immediate needs of the population and simply served to enrich arms dealers. His outspoken criticism of the war and the military's top brass, even amidst his battlefield heroics, signaled his growing defiance. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a political actor, unafraid to voice unpopular truths. These early clashes with the Upper Volta government were subtle but significant. His reputation as an intelligent, principled, and increasingly radical officer began to spread. The authorities, while recognizing his military talent, also became wary of his independent spirit and his burgeoning influence among younger officers. He was transferred, often to remote postings, in an attempt to curb his activism. But each transfer, each attempt to silence him, only seemed to further harden his resolve. The fire had been awakened, and it was quickly becoming inextinguishable, illuminating a path that would lead him from the quiet descent of a young officer to the forefront of a burgeoning revolution. The stage was being set for a dramatic confrontation between the old order and the fiery idealism of Thomas Sankara. Chapter 4. Brothers in Arms. The simmering discontent within the Upper Volta military, fueled by young officers like Thomas Sankara, found its most potent expression in the revolutionary alliance forged between Sankara and Blaise Compaoré. Their paths had crossed earlier, but it was in the crucible of shared ideology and mutual ambition that their bond solidified, a fraternity that would redefine their nation's destiny before ultimately fracturing with devastating consequences. Compaoré, though less intellectually inclined than Sankara, possessed a shrewd political instinct and a talent for organization. He was charismatic in his own right, a powerful complement to Sankara's fiery idealism. Both men were veterans of the 1974 Agadir Strip War, where they had witnessed firsthand the inefficiencies and moral compromises of the existing military and political establishment. They shared a deep-seated frustration with the corruption and neo-colonial influence that kept Upper Volta in a state of arrested development. Their conversations, often clandestine and intense, revolved around the urgent need for radical change. They envisioned a genuine revolution, one that would sweep away the old order and empower the long-suffering people of Upper Volta. Together, Sankara and Compaoré became the driving force behind a clandestine network of revolutionary officers and civilian activists. This network, later to be known as the Group of Communist Officers, Regroupement des Officiers Communistes (ROC), was far more than just a military faction. It was a political movement operating in the shadows. They meticulously studied revolutionary theory, debated strategies for societal transformation, and critiqued the post-colonial African state. Sankara, with his sharp intellect and inspiring rhetoric, was the ideologue and the moral compass, while Compaoré, a pragmatist and a master of covert operations, handled the logistical and tactical aspects of their burgeoning conspiracy. Their revolutionary alliance was built on a shared vision of a liberated Upper Volta, free from foreign domination and internal exploitation, a nation where its people could finally stand tall. The opportunity for decisive action arose in the early 1980s. Upper Volta continued to be plagued by instability, marked by a series of coups and counter-coups that merely shuffled corrupt elites. In November 1982, Major Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo seized power. While initially viewed with cautious optimism by some, his regime quickly proved to be another iteration of the familiar pattern, beholden to external forces and resistant to genuine reform. Sankara, who had served briefly in Ouédraogo's government as Secretary of State for Information, grew increasingly frustrated with its conservatism and its willingness to compromise with vested interests. His outspoken criticism led to his arrest and detention in May 1983, a move that only galvanized his supporters and underscored the government's fear of his growing popularity. It was this moment of crisis that prompted the Revolutionary Alliance to act. With Sankara imprisoned, Compaoré and his allies within the ROC swung into action. The plan was audacious and risky. It involved meticulous coordination, leveraging their contacts within various army units, and securing the support of civilian groups who were equally tired of the political merry-go-round. On the night of August 4, 1983, the coup was executed with precision and minimal bloodshed. Blaise Compaoré led the charge, securing key military installations and government buildings. Within hours, President Ouédraogo was overthrown, and the leadership of the new government was firmly in the hands of the revolutionary officers. The coup was swiftly declared a, quote, popular democratic revolution. This was not merely a change of government. It was proclaimed as a fundamental break with Upper Volta's colonial past and its neo-colonial present. Thomas Sankara, liberated from prison, was immediately elevated to the position of President of the National Council of the Revolution, CNR, the country's new governing body. At the age of 33, he had become the youngest head of state in Africa. The immediate aftermath of the coup was marked by an explosion of revolutionary fervor. Sankara, with his charismatic speeches and unwavering commitment to the people, articulated a vision that resonated deeply with the aspirations of ordinary Burkinabe. He spoke of dignity, self-reliance, and justice, promises that had long been denied. The popular democratic revolution was presented not as a military takeover, but as a genuine uprising of the people, for the people. Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, were established across the country, ostensibly as organs of popular participation, drawing in ordinary citizens to support the new government's agenda. The early days of the revolution were a period of intense idealism and hope. Sankara, Compaoré, Lingani, and Zongo, the four principal leaders, were brothers in arms united by a shared purpose. They believed they were embarking on a transformative journey, not just for Upper Volta, but as an example for the entire African continent. The world watched with a mixture of apprehension and admiration as a young, outspoken revolutionary took the reins of power, promising to dismantle the old order and build a new society from its ashes. The stage was set for a truly radical experiment in African governance, one driven by the fiery conviction of its young leaders. Chapter 5. President of the People. On August 4, 1983, at the astonishing age of 33, Captain Thomas Sankara officially became the president of Upper Volta, the head of the National Council of the Revolution, CNR. His ascension was not merely a change of guard, but the dawn of a radical experiment in governance, born from a profound conviction that leadership meant serving the people, not ruling over them. From his very first pronouncements, Sankara signaled a clear departure from the opulent and self-serving regimes that had long plagued post-colonial Africa. He was determined to lead by example, and his immediate action set the tone for what he termed the democratic and popular revolution. The revolutionary government wasted no time in implementing a sweeping agenda of reform, focusing on the most pressing needs of the Burkinabe populace: education, agriculture, and public health. These were not mere policy adjustments, but fundamental shifts, aimed at dismantling the colonial legacy of underdevelopment and empowering the masses. In education, Sankara recognized that illiteracy was a major impediment to true liberation and progress. He launched an ambitious nationwide literacy campaign, Alpha Commando, mobilizing thousands of volunteers to teach reading and writing in local languages. Schools were built at an unprecedented pace, often by the communities themselves with government support, and teacher training programs were expanded. The goal was not just to impart basic skills, but to foster critical thinking and political consciousness, ensuring that citizens could understand and participate in the revolutionary process. Education was seen as a tool for decolonization of the mind, essential for building a self-reliant nation. Agriculture was the bedrock of Upper Volta's economy, yet it was plagued by outdated methods, foreign dependency, and exploitative land practices. Sankara's government initiated a series of agrarian reforms aimed at boosting food self-sufficiency. Land was redistributed to peasants, water conservation projects were launched, and traditional farming techniques were modernized with appropriate technology. He famously declared, "Let's consume what we produce, and produce what we consume." The revolution encouraged the cultivation of staple crops, particularly millet and sorghum, over cash crops dictated by external markets. This focus on food sovereignty was a direct challenge to the neo-colonial economic structures that kept African nations reliant on foreign aid and imports. The state of public health in Upper Volta was dire, with high rates of infant mortality and preventable diseases. Sankara tackled this crisis head-on with an audacious vaccination campaign. Within weeks of the coup, a massive nationwide immunization drive was launched, targeting polio, meningitis, and measles. Teams of health workers, often military personnel repurposed for public service, traversed remote villages, reaching millions of children. This unprecedented effort resulted in a dramatic reduction in child mortality rates and garnered international praise, demonstrating the power of a committed government to achieve monumental public health goals even with limited resources. Additionally, efforts were made to build new health clinics and train more local healthcare providers, aiming to democratize access to basic medical care. Beyond these tangible policies, perhaps the most striking aspect of Sankara's presidency was his unwavering commitment to governance by example. He immediately set about dismantling the symbols of elite privilege and wasteful spending that characterized previous African leaders. The presidential fleet of luxury Mercedes-Benz cars was sold off, replaced by more modest Renault 5s. Government ministers were mandated to wear faso d'enfani, the traditional woven cotton cloth, a direct rejection of Western suits, and a promotion of local industry and cultural pride. Sankara himself led the charge in austerity. He slashed his own salary, reportedly reducing it to the equivalent of around $450 a month, and required his ministers and senior officials to follow suit. The air conditioning in government offices was often turned off, and lavish state functions were replaced by simpler, more communal gatherings. He refused to allow his image to be placed on public buildings or currency, a stark contrast to the cults of personality prevalent across the continent. His modest lifestyle was legendary. He drove his own car, lived in a small, unpretentious house, and was often seen in public without extensive security. These actions were not mere symbolic gestures. They were deeply rooted in his revolutionary ideology. By cutting salaries and privileges, Sankara sought to sever the ties between public service and personal enrichment, aiming to redefine leadership as a burden of responsibility rather than an opportunity for plunder. He aimed to dismantle the very system that created a corrupt ruling class detached from the realities of the common people. This commitment to integrity and sacrifice, though sometimes criticized for its idealism, resonated powerfully with the vast majority of Burkinabe, who had long suffered under leaders who preached sacrifice while living in luxury. Thomas Sankara was truly becoming the president of the people, and his revolutionary vision was quickly taking shape, promising a new dawn for a nation long obscured by the shadows of its past. Chapter 6. A New Nation with a New Name. For Thomas Sankara, true revolution meant more than just changing policies. It meant transforming the very soul of a nation. This conviction manifested most powerfully on August 4, 1984, the first anniversary of the revolution, when he announced a profound symbolic act, the renaming of Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. The old name, a geographical descriptor imposed by French colonizers, literally meant Upper Volta River, a passive label tied to a European perspective. The new name, a fusion of two indigenous languages, was a defiant assertion of identity and purpose. Burkina from Mure, meaning men of integrity or upright people, and Faso from Dioula, meaning fatherland. Together, Burkina Faso translated to the land of upright people, or the land of incorruptible people. This was far more than a linguistic flourish. It was a powerful act of decolonization, a rejection of the colonial past, and a bold declaration of a new national character. Sankara understood that names carry immense psychological weight. By choosing a name that resonated with dignity, integrity, and self-respect, he aimed to instill a profound sense of pride and ownership in every citizen. The Burkinabe people were no longer subjects of a foreign-named territory. They were the architects of their own destiny, inheritors of a land defined by their own values. This renaming served as a unifying force, inviting every individual to embrace the collective responsibility of building a nation worthy of its new, noble designation. The rebranding of the nation was accompanied by an intensified drive on the key social programs initiated in the revolution's early days. The nationwide literacy campaign, already underway, gained new momentum under the banner of the newly christened Burkina Faso. Thousands of volunteers, from students to soldiers, fanned out across the vast and often remote countryside, teaching adults and children alike to read and write in their own languages. Literacy was not just about acquiring skills, it was about political empowerment, enabling citizens to understand government directives, engage in public discourse, and challenge misinformation. It was a direct assault on the legacy of ignorance that colonialism had perpetuated, a tool for intellectual liberation. Similarly, the ambitious vaccination campaigns continued with relentless vigor. Having already achieved remarkable initial success, the government pressed on, demonstrating its commitment to public health as a fundamental human right. Mobile medical teams, supported by the military and local community leaders, reached areas that had never seen a doctor or nurse. The image of young soldiers, guns laid aside, administering vaccines to eager children, became a powerful symbol of the Army's new role as a force for development and human well-being, rather than just conflict. These campaigns not only saved countless lives, but also fostered a sense of collective purpose and trust in the revolutionary government. For many Burkinabe, these tangible improvements in their lives were the most direct evidence of the revolution's promise. Beyond the grand gestures and vital campaigns, Sankara skillfully employed symbolism and pride-building at every turn. The adoption of the faso d'enfani, the traditionally woven cotton cloth, as the official dress for government officials was a prime example. It was a statement of cultural pride, an economic stimulus for local weavers, and a visible rejection of Western sartorial norms that had come to symbolize colonial deference. He encouraged communal labor, le travaux de développement communautaire, where citizens participated in building schools, roads, and dams. This fostered a sense of shared responsibility and collective achievement. Even the national anthem and flag were revamped to reflect the new revolutionary spirit. Sankara himself penned the lyrics to Ditanye, the anthem of victory, a rousing call to arms against oppression and a celebration of the Burkinabe spirit of resistance and self-reliance. The new flag, with its red for revolution and green for hope and abundance, stripes and a yellow star for guiding light at its center, further solidified this new identity. These symbols were not decorative. They were pedagogical tools, constantly reminding the people of their history, their struggle, and their shared future. Through these bold actions, renaming the nation, driving essential social campaigns, and leveraging powerful symbols, Thomas Sankara was meticulously crafting a new national narrative. He was not just governing a country, he was forging a collective identity, inspiring a pride that had long been dormant. He was telling his people that they were capable, dignified, and upright, and that their collective strength could indeed build a new, truly independent Burkina Faso. The land of upright people was beginning to stand tall. Chapter 7. Feminism and the Revolutionary Man. While many revolutionary leaders focused primarily on economic and political liberation, Thomas Sankara distinguished himself with a profound and unwavering commitment to women's rights, a stance that was not merely progressive but truly revolutionary for its time and context, particularly in conservative West African society. For Sankara, the liberation of the Burkinabe people was inextricably linked to the liberation of its women. He famously declared, "There is no true social revolution without the liberation of women." This was not empty rhetoric. His government implemented a series of bold, unprecedented policies designed to fundamentally alter the patriarchal structures that had long oppressed women in Upper Volta. Sankara's approach to gender equality was holistic, addressing both systemic and cultural barriers. He recognized that traditional practices, often deeply ingrained, were significant impediments to women's full participation in society. His administration was the first in Africa to actively recruit women into the military. This was a radical move that challenged deeply held beliefs about women's roles and capabilities. Images of female cadets, in crisp uniforms, training alongside men, sent a powerful message both domestically and internationally. These women were not mere token gestures. They were to be fully integrated into the armed forces, serving in various capacities, embodying the principle that women were equally capable of defending the nation and contributing to its security. This policy aimed to break down gender stereotypes and demonstrate that physical strength and courage were not exclusive to men. Beyond the military, Sankara's government took groundbreaking steps to ensure women's economic empowerment, crucially by granting them land ownership rights. In a predominantly agrarian society where land was the primary means of production and wealth, this was a seismic shift. Traditionally, land was almost exclusively owned by men, denying women economic autonomy and perpetuating their dependence. By allowing women to own and inherit land, Sankara directly challenged patriarchal inheritance customs and provided women with a tangible asset that improved their economic standing, food security, and bargaining power within their households and communities. This policy was a powerful recognition of women's role as vital agricultural producers and a fundamental step towards economic justice. Perhaps one of Sankara's most courageous and controversial policies was the outlawing of female genital mutilation, FGM, forced marriages, and polygamy. These practices were deeply embedded in many Burkinabe communities, justified by tradition and cultural norms. To challenge them head-on required immense political will and a willingness to confront powerful vested interests. Sankara's government launched public awareness campaigns, educating communities about the harmful health consequences of FGM and advocating for the dignity and bodily autonomy of women. While enforcement was challenging and resistance was significant in some areas, the very act of criminalizing these practices sent a clear message that the state would not tolerate the oppression of women under the guise of tradition. He emphasized education as the key to changing mindsets, believing that true liberation would come from within the communities themselves. These policies, coupled with other initiatives such as promoting women's access to education, encouraging women to hold positions in government and public life, and even attempting to integrate men into household chores by declaring a housework day for civil servants, garnered global praise. International feminist organizations, human rights groups, and progressive thinkers around the world lauded Sankara as a visionary leader, a true champion of gender equality in a continent where such issues were often ignored or relegated to secondary importance. His speeches on women's rights at international forums were often met with applause and admiration, positioning Burkina Faso as a beacon of progressive social reform. However, domestically, these bold policies were met with significant local backlash, particularly from conservative elements, traditional elders, and religious leaders, who viewed them as an attack on cultural identity and established social order. The outlawing of FGM and forced marriage, in particular, stirred considerable resentment. Some men felt their authority was being undermined, while certain women, deeply ingrained in traditional structures, were hesitant to embrace such radical changes. The concept of women serving in the military was met with ridicule and scorn in some quarters. While Sankara's personal charisma and the fervor of the revolution helped to push these policies forward, the resistance they engendered created internal tensions that would contribute to the growing fragility of his regime. Despite the challenges, Sankara remained steadfast in his commitment to women's liberation. He understood that a revolution that did not liberate half of its population was incomplete. His policies laid the groundwork for future advancements in women's rights in Burkina Faso and continued to inspire activists across Africa and beyond. He dared to imagine a society where gender was not a barrier to dignity, opportunity, or participation, a vision that solidified his legacy as a truly revolutionary leader, a feminist man ahead of his time. Chapter 8. Sankara versus the World. Thomas Sankara's revolutionary fervor was not confined to the borders of Burkina Faso. He understood that his nation's struggle for true sovereignty was inextricably linked to the broader challenges facing Africa and the global South. From the moment he seized power, Sankara embarked on a relentless campaign to articulate his vision on the international stage, challenging the very architecture of global power dynamics and becoming an outspoken critic of the institutions that he believed perpetuated Africa's underdevelopment. His most iconic performances came at the highest diplomatic forums, the United Nations General Assembly and the Organization of African Unity, OAU. At the UN in October 1984, Sankara delivered a blistering, unscripted speech that stunned delegates with its raw honesty and uncompromising condemnation of neocolonialism. He spoke not as a supplicant seeking aid, but as a defiant leader demanding justice. He railed against the crushing burden of African debt, calling it a skillfully managed reconquest of Africa, and urging a united front among African nations to repudiate it. "We cannot repay the debt," he declared, "because we have nothing to pay with." His words were a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the global financial system, and a clarion call for African unity and self-reliance. He spoke with a passionate conviction that was rare among heads of state, bypassing diplomatic niceties to speak truth to power. Similarly, at OAU summits, Sankara was a thorn in the side of his fellow African leaders. He criticized their complicity with former colonial masters, their corruption, and their reluctance to genuinely break free from Western influence. He chastised them for their lavish lifestyles while their people suffered, contrasting his own austerity measures with their private jets and Swiss bank accounts. He pushed relentlessly for greater intra-African cooperation and economic integration, arguing that only through unity could the continent truly resist external manipulation. His directness, while applauded by progressive voices, often made him unpopular among his more conservative counterparts, who preferred the diplomatic status quo. At the heart of Sankara's international stance was his fierce opposition to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. He viewed these institutions not as benevolent development partners, but as instruments of neo-colonial control, imposing structural adjustment programs that undermine national sovereignty crippled public services, and forced African nations into a spiral of perpetual debt. He argued that their policies, which often demanded privatization, currency devaluations, and cuts to social spending, only served to deepen poverty and increase dependence on the very powers that exploited Africa's resources. He refused to accept loans with conditions he deemed exploitative, prioritizing self-reliance over conditional foreign assistance. This led directly to his most famous and poignant rejection: foreign aid. Sankara's stance was encapsulated in his powerful declaration: "He who feeds you controls you." He believed that reliance on foreign aid perpetuated a subservient mentality, stifled local initiative, and created an unsustainable cycle of dependency. He argued that much of the aid was tied to conditions that benefited donor countries more than recipients, or that it fostered corruption among local elites. Instead, he championed the concept of counting on our own forces, urging Burkinabe to rely on their ingenuity, labor, and resources to build their nation. He launched massive public works projects, like the construction of railways and roads, using local labor and materials, rather than waiting for foreign investment. This radical approach challenged the very foundation of international development models and earned him both admirers and powerful enemies. Sankara's unyielding independence and his outspoken criticism of the global economic order made him a dangerous figure in the eyes of many Western powers and their African allies. He was seen as unpredictable, a potential destabilizing force in a region traditionally under French influence. His connections with other revolutionary leaders like Fidel Castro and his embrace of anti-imperialist rhetoric only heightened suspicions. While his speeches resonated with many oppressed peoples around the world, his defiance directly threatened the established international financial and political architecture. He was not just a leader of a small, impoverished nation. He was a voice for a new, unapologetically independent Africa, and in doing so, he inevitably pitted Sankara versus the world. This courageous yet ultimately isolating stance would contribute to the internal and external pressures that would eventually consume his revolution. Chapter 9: Planting Trees Against the Future. While Thomas Sankara is often remembered for his fiery anti-imperialist rhetoric and his bold social reforms, another, equally visionary aspect of his presidency set him apart: his pioneering commitment to environmental activism. Long before climate change became a mainstream global concern, Sankara recognized the existential threat posed by desertification and ecological degradation, particularly in the fragile Sahel region. For him, protecting the environment was not a peripheral issue, but a fundamental component of the revolution, a necessary step towards the long-term well-being and self-sufficiency of the Burkinabe people. He famously stated, "Man cannot live on stolen wealth, nor on nature that is plundered. We must protect our planet." Upper Volta, and subsequently Burkina Faso, lies in the Sahel, a semi-arid zone that serves as a transition between the Sahara Desert to the north and the savannas to the south. This region is particularly vulnerable to the advancing desert, exacerbated by overgrazing, deforestation for fuel wood, and unsustainable agricultural practices. Sankara understood that without addressing these environmental challenges, all other developmental efforts would ultimately fail. He saw the fight against desertification as a direct battle for the future of his nation. His administration launched an ambitious and unprecedented reforestation program. This wasn't merely about planting a few trees. It was a nationwide mobilization effort. Trees were seen as living shields against the encroaching desert, vital for soil conservation, water retention, and providing essential resources. He encouraged every Burkinabe citizen to participate, turning tree planting into a civic duty and a symbol of national renewal. Schools, villages, military units, and government departments were all tasked with planting and nurturing saplings. Millions of trees were planted across the country during his tenure, a monumental undertaking that demonstrated the power of collective action. Beyond reforestation, Sankara spearheaded multifaceted efforts to green the Sahel. This included campaigns to prevent bushfires, which devastated vast tracts of land annually. He promoted the use of alternative energy sources to reduce reliance on wood for fuel and encouraged more sustainable farming practices. He also implemented water management projects, including small dams and irrigation schemes, to capture and conserve precious rainwater. These initiatives were often carried out through the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, transforming them from political organizations into instruments of communal environmental action. Villagers were mobilized to construct earth dams and terraces, actively participating in the transformation of their own landscapes. What makes Sankara truly remarkable in this regard is that he was one of the earliest African leaders to embrace ecological policy with such conviction and at such a national scale. In an era when most developing nations were focused solely on industrialization and economic growth, often at the expense of environmental concerns, Sankara sounded an alarm about ecological destruction. He articulated the interconnectedness of environmental health, human well-being, and national sovereignty. He recognized that environmental degradation disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized, and that a sustainable future required a holistic approach that integrated ecological principles into all aspects of national development. His environmental vision was also deeply intertwined with his anti-imperialist stance. He argued that the ecological crisis in Africa was partly a legacy of colonial exploitation, which had stripped the continent of its natural resources, and partly a consequence of global economic systems that pushed developing countries into unsustainable practices. He called for an international environmental consciousness, urging developed nations to take responsibility for their historical impact on the planet and to support sustainable development in the global south without imposing exploitative conditions. Sankara's environmental policies were met with skepticism by some who saw them as a distraction from immediate economic problems, but they laid vital groundwork for future environmental movements in Africa. He demonstrated that even a poor nation could prioritize ecological sustainability and mobilize its people to achieve ambitious environmental goals. Planting trees against the future was more than just a literal act. It was a metaphor for investing in long-term resilience, for building a sustainable future, and for challenging the short-sighted, exploitative practices that threaten not just Burkina Faso, but the entire planet. His ecological foresight stands as a testament to his comprehensive vision of liberation, one that extended beyond human politics to encompass the very earth beneath his people's feet. Chapter 10. Internal Storms. The revolutionary fervor that swept Thomas Sankara into power and fueled his ambitious reforms inevitably began to generate friction, both within his government and across various segments of Burkinabe society. The pace and radical nature of his transformation agenda, coupled with his uncompromising idealism, meant that not everyone could or would keep pace. As the initial euphoria of the popular democratic revolution began to wane, the inherent challenges of radical change bred growing tensions inside his government. Sankara's unwavering commitment to austerity and social justice meant that he was systematically alienating elites who had long benefited from the previous corrupt systems. The old political class, stripped of their lavish privileges and influence, resented their diminished status. Their access to state resources, once a given, was now severely restricted, if not entirely cut off. Businessmen, particularly those involved in import-export or state contracts, found their avenues for quick profit curtailed by Sankara's emphasis on self-reliance, local production, and strict anti-corruption measures. Projects that had once been lucrative opportunities for kickbacks were now scrutinized under a harsh revolutionary light. Their resentment simmered, transforming into a dangerous undercurrent of opposition. Beyond the overtly corrupt, even those who might have considered themselves legitimate entrepreneurs found the revolutionary climate challenging. Sankara's policies often prioritized collective good over individual accumulation of wealth, and his rhetoric was sometimes perceived as anti-business. This created an atmosphere of uncertainty for private enterprise, making it difficult for many to adapt or thrive under the new rules. Crucially, Sankara also began to alienate powerful military factions. While the initial coup had been orchestrated by a core group of young, idealistic officers, the broader military establishment harbored diverse interests and loyalties. Many senior officers, accustomed to traditional hierarchies and the perks of power, chafed under Sankara's populist approach and his insistence on military personnel participating in civilian projects like vaccination campaigns and tree planting. They viewed his integration of the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, essentially armed civilian militias, as a threat to their authority and a blurring of the lines between military and civilian roles. Some saw the CDRs as overly zealous or even oppressive, leading to abuses of power that tarnished the military's professional image. Sankara's anti-corruption drives within the military also hit close to home for officers who had benefited from illicit dealings or inflated budgets. The discipline and austerity he preached extended to the barracks, leading to a quiet but growing dissent among those who felt their professional dignity or financial interests were being undermined. However, the most significant and ultimately fatal storm brewed in the relationship strains with Blaise Compaoré. What began as a revolutionary alliance between brothers in arms gradually fractured under the weight of ideological differences, personal ambitions, and the sheer pressure of governing. While Sankara was the ideologue and the charismatic visionary, Compaoré was the pragmatic operator, the man who had the deep connections within the military and understood the levers of power. Their divergence began subtly. Compaoré, along with other key figures like Henri Zongo and Jean-Baptiste Bukari-Lingani, the other two members of the original group of communist officers, increasingly found Sankara's radicalism too uncompromising and his revolutionary pace too fast. Compaoré was reportedly more open to pragmatic compromises with international financial institutions and neighboring countries, viewing Sankara's rigid anti-imperialist stance as potentially isolating Burkina Faso. He may also have harbored personal ambitions, chafing at perpetually being in Sankara's shadow, despite his crucial role in the coup and his significant influence within the armed forces. Sankara, in turn, began to grow suspicious of Compaoré's increasing network of alliances, both within the military and with external actors. His own idealism may have blinded him to the growing cracks in their relationship, or perhaps he simply refused to believe that his closest comrade could betray the revolution. The ideological debates became sharper, the disagreements more frequent, and the personal trust began to erode. Whispers of a widening rift spread through government circles and the military, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty. These internal storms, the alienation of powerful societal groups, the growing military dissent, and the irreparable fracture with his closest ally, created a volatile cocktail. The revolution, which had promised so much, was now vulnerable from within. The foundations of the land of upright people were being eroded not just by external pressures, but by the very forces that had helped build it, setting the stage for a tragic unraveling. Chapter 11. Spies, Enemies, and the Shadow of France. Thomas Sankara's revolutionary defiance, broadcast from the heart of the Sahel, inevitably drew the unwelcome attention of powerful international actors. His uncompromising stance against neocolonialism and his radical vision for an independent Africa directly challenged the established order, making Burkina Faso a focal point of suspicion and concern. As the internal storms brewed, external forces were also actively observing, plotting, and sometimes intervening, creating a climate of intense pressure, surveillance, and a growing, palpable paranoia around Sankara. At the forefront of these external eyes was France, the former colonial power. Paris had historically maintained a tight grip on its former West African colonies, often through client states and carefully cultivated relationships with compliant leaders. Sankara, with his public repudiation of French influence, his promotion of African self-reliance, and his criticism of the CFA franc, the common currency pegged to the French franc, was seen as a dangerous anomaly, a direct threat to French interests and prestige in the region. French intelligence services, notably the DGSE, undoubtedly kept close tabs on Burkina Faso, monitoring Sankara's movements, communications, and alliances. The fear was that Sankara's revolutionary model could inspire similar uprisings in other francophone African nations, destabilizing a carefully constructed sphere of influence. Neighboring countries, particularly Ivory Coast under the long-reigning Félix Houphouët-Boigny, also viewed Sankara with deep suspicion. Houphouët-Boigny, a staunchly pro-Western and conservative leader, saw Sankara's radicalism as a direct threat to his own stability and economic model, which was heavily reliant on French investment and export agriculture. Ivory Coast became a haven for Burkinabe exiles and disgruntled elements, some of whom actively plotted against Sankara's regime with tacit, if not overt, Ivorian support. Border tensions escalated, and the rhetoric from Abidjan often painted Sankara as a dangerous communist. Further afield, the United States and its Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, were keenly interested. The Cold War was still very much in play, and any nation that embraced socialist or anti-imperialist rhetoric was immediately viewed through the lens of East-West competition. While Sankara was not a Soviet puppet, he critiqued both Western capitalism and Soviet-style communism. His alignment with figures like Fidel Castro and his embrace of certain Marxist principles raised red flags in Washington. The CIA's objective was to prevent the spread of perceived communist influence in strategically important regions, and Sankara's example could be seen as a dangerous precedent. Surveillance, infiltration, and the cultivation of opposition elements were standard operating procedures for intelligence agencies during this era. The geopolitics of West Africa during the Cold War created a complex and perilous environment for a leader like Sankara. The region was a chessboard for proxy struggles and ideological competition. Countries were often forced to align with either the Western Bloc or the Soviet Bloc, and leaders who attempted a genuinely independent path were often seen as threats by both sides. Sankara's determined non-alignment, while ideologically pure, left him without a major patron to guarantee his security against external pressures. He was a small player attempting to rewrite the rules of a very large, dangerous game. Under such intense scrutiny, Sankara's surveillance, distrust, and mounting paranoia were not entirely unfounded. He was aware of the vast intelligence networks at play, and he knew he had powerful enemies. His government implemented its own counterintelligence measures, and security around him was tight. However, the constant threat, the knowledge that former allies could be compromised or turned, and the very real danger of assassination attempts took a psychological toll. He began to trust fewer people, particularly as the internal rifts within his own government widened. His speeches, while still defiant, sometimes carried a note of increasing isolation. He understood that his revolution was under siege, not just from within, but from a formidable array of international forces determined to see his radical experiment fail. This climate of suspicion and fear, combined with the growing internal dissent, created the perfect storm, making his regime increasingly vulnerable to the ultimate betrayal. Chapter 12. The Assassination. The internal storms and external pressures that had been steadily building around Thomas Sankara culminated in a brutal, irreversible act of betrayal. The mounting distrust and ideological clashes, particularly with his closest comrade Blaise Compaoré, reached their tragic zenith on October 15, 1987. That fateful day, a counter-revolution disguised as a power struggle erupted in Ouagadougou, forever silencing the voice of Africa's most audacious revolutionary. The morning of October 15th began like any other, but the air in the capital was thick with a nervous tension that had become increasingly palpable in recent months. Rumors of a rift between Sankara and Compaoré were no longer whispers but open discussions. That afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., as Thomas Sankara held a meeting with his cabinet at the Conseil de l'Entente, the complex that housed the National Council of the Revolution, the sounds of gunfire shattered the relative calm. Within minutes, the meeting room was stormed by a commando unit. Accounts of the assassination vary in detail, but the outcome is chillingly consistent. Sankara, refusing to hide, reportedly stepped out of the meeting room, perhaps to confront the attackers or to defend his colleagues. He was met with a hail of bullets. He died instantly, his body riddled with wounds. 12 other officials present at the meeting were also killed, including his aide-de-camp, Captain Faustin Tuende. The scene was one of chaos and terror, marking the brutal end of a revolutionary dream. There was little doubt from the outset how Blaise Compaoré orchestrated the betrayal. While he did not personally pull the trigger, the coup was meticulously planned and executed by forces loyal to him. Compaoré had spent months, if not longer, consolidating his power base within the military and cultivating alliances with elements alienated by Sankara's radical policies. He skillfully exploited the grievances of disgruntled officers, the anxieties of the traditional elite, and the concerns of neighboring states and foreign powers who viewed Sankara as a threat. The intelligence services of France and Ivory Coast are widely believed to have been aware of the plot, if not actively complicit, providing tacit approval or even logistical support. Compaoré's motive was a combination of ideological divergence. He favored a more pragmatic, less confrontational approach to international relations and economic policy, and raw ambition. He desired to emerge from Sankara's towering shadow and seize ultimate control. The coup was swift and decisive. Compaoré immediately took power, initially claiming that Sankara had been trying to escape and was caught in a crossfire. This flimsy narrative quickly crumbled in the face of eyewitness accounts and the overwhelming evidence of a premeditated assassination. The revolutionary dream, built on ideals of integrity and popular participation, was buried under a torrent of propaganda and fear. Reactions to Sankara's death were starkly divided. In Burkina Faso, a pervasive silence followed the assassination. The initial shock quickly gave way to fear. Compaoré's regime swiftly moved to dismantle the structures of the revolution. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, were either disbanded or brought under strict government control, the members intimidated or arrested. Any public display of mourning or dissent was brutally suppressed. State media propagated a narrative that justified the coup, portraying Sankara as an extremist, a dictator, and a danger to national stability. Many Burkinabé, traumatized and intimidated, outwardly conformed, while privately grappling with disbelief and grief. Internationally, the news was met with a mix of condemnation, muted regret, and quiet relief. African progressives and human rights advocates mourned the loss of a visionary leader, recognizing the immense blow to the continent's struggle for true independence. Some Western powers, while issuing pro forma statements of concern, were privately relieved that the unpredictable and outspoken Sankara was no longer a disruptive force in a strategically important region. The world moved on, but the silence that descended upon Burkina Faso spoke volumes about the fear and repression that had taken hold. For nearly 3 decades, the truth about Sankara's assassination would remain officially suppressed. His grave was unmarked, his memory systematically erased from public discourse. The man who had dared to rename his nation and inspire a continent was reduced to a dangerous phantom, his legacy buried under the weight of a new dictatorship. But the seeds he had planted of integrity, self-reliance, and dignity would prove far more resilient than his assassins could ever have imagined. The silence that followed his death was profound, but it would not last forever. Chapter 13. A Revolution Buried. The echo of the gunshots that ended Thomas Sankara's life on October 15, 1987, quickly faded into the chilling silence of a nation gripped by fear. Blaise Compaoré, the man who had been Sankara's brother in arms, wasted no time in consolidating his power, immediately setting about the systematic dismantling of Sankara's reforms. The popular democratic revolution was not merely stopped, it was actively reversed, its core tenets replaced with policies that were anathema to Sankara's vision. Compaore's regime swiftly moved to undo the very foundations of Sankara's self-reliance agenda. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, once hailed as organs of popular power, were rebranded, purged, or outright abolished, effectively neutralizing the revolutionary fervor and any potential popular resistance. The ambitious literacy and vaccination campaigns, once national priorities, lost their momentum and comprehensive scope, gradually fading into routine, underfunded government programs. The focus on food self-sufficiency shifted back towards traditional cash crops and dependence on foreign markets and aid. Economically, Compaore quickly pivoted towards policies favored by the very institutions Sankara had so fiercely resisted. Burkina Faso re-engaged with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, adopting structural adjustment programs that included privatization of state-owned enterprises, cuts to public spending, and liberalization of the economy. While these policies garnered approval from international creditors, they often led to increased social inequality and a re-entrenchment of the neo-colonial economic structures Sankara had fought so hard to dismantle. The era of austerity and national pride in local produce was replaced by an open-door policy for foreign investment, often with little regard for the social or environmental consequences. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Compaore's takeover was the official cover-up, the pervasive fear, and the establishment of a 27-year dictatorship. The narrative propagated by the new regime was a carefully constructed lie. Sankara was portrayed as a dangerous despot who had betrayed the revolution, an authoritarian who needed to be removed for the good of the nation. The official version of events on October 15th was consistently manipulated, and any questioning was met with brutal suppression. Dissidents were arrested, exiled, or disappeared. State media became a tool for propaganda, systematically erasing Sankara's positive contributions and demonizing his legacy. This climate of fear ensured public compliance. People learned quickly that speaking Sankara's name or expressing admiration for his ideals could lead to severe repercussions. The omnipresent security apparatus stifled open discourse, forcing dissent into the shadows. The very values of integrity and uprightness that Sankara had championed were subverted, replaced by a culture of patronage, corruption, and self-preservation that enabled Compaore to maintain an iron grip on power for nearly 3 decades. His regime, backed by discreet but crucial support from external powers, became a classic example of a post-colonial African strongman, prioritizing stability and personal enrichment over genuine democratic progress. The most profound casualty of this new era was the systematic suppression of the memory of Thomas Sankara. His image was removed from public spaces. Educational curricula were revised to omit or distort his contributions. His burial site remained unmarked for years, a desperate attempt to erase his physical presence from the collective consciousness. The aim was to make him a non-person, a forgotten chapter in Burkina Faso's history. The vibrant intellectual and political debates that had characterized Sankara's revolution were replaced by an enforced silence. Children grew up learning a sanitized history, largely unaware of the radical path their country had once briefly trodden. However, the effort to bury Sankara's memory, though effective for a long time, was ultimately incomplete. While outwardly compliant, many Burkinabe, particularly the youth and those who had directly experienced the revolutionary years, held on to the dream. The seeds of his ideas, though buried deep beneath layers of repression and forgetting, were not dead. They lay dormant, waiting for a future moment of awakening, a time when the land of upright people might once again dare to remember its most upright son. The 27-year dictatorship of Blaise Compaore was a long winter for Sankara's legacy, but spring, however distant, would eventually come. Chapter 14. Resurrection of a Legend. For nearly 3 decades, the name of Thomas Sankara was a whispered secret in Burkina Faso, his image systematically suppressed, his legacy buried under the weight of Blaise Compaore's authoritarian regime. But the seeds of his ideas, like resilient desert plants, lay dormant, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. That moment arrived not just from within Burkina Faso, but through a powerful global resurgence of Sankara's image that slowly but surely began to pierce the veil of silence. Initially, the revival began in the diaspora and among Pan-Africanist intellectuals and activists who kept Sankara's flame alive. His speeches, particularly his famous address to the UN, circulated online, inspiring a new generation far removed from the Cold War context of his time. His unwavering stance against imperialism, his commitment to self-reliance, and his radical honesty resonated with young people across Africa and beyond, disillusioned with post-colonial leaders and the pervasive influence of globalization. Books, documentaries, and academic papers began to critically reevaluate his legacy, moving him from a forgotten footnote to a central figure in anti-colonial thought. The digital age played a crucial role. Social media platforms became conduits for sharing his quotes, images, and videos, allowing his message to bypass state-controlled media and reach a global audience. He became a symbol of uncorrupted leadership, integrity, and genuine African liberation, a stark contrast to the often corrupt and compliant leaders who followed him. Students, activists, and artists adopted him as an icon of resistance. This global recognition eventually began to feed back into Burkina Faso. As Compaoré's rule stretched into its third decade, marked by growing discontent over corruption, economic stagnation, and the lack of political freedoms, the contrast with Sankara's remembered integrity became unbearable. The youth, in particular, who had only known Compaoré's dictatorship, began to discover Sankara through these external channels, finding in him a powerful antidote to their frustrations. This burgeoning rediscovery manifested in tangible ways. Statues began to appear, initially unofficially, then later with greater public demand, commemorating his ideals. His image adorned t-shirts, murals, and protest banners. Music, a powerful medium for social commentary in West Africa, became a vehicle for his resurrection. Artists composed songs praising his vision and lamenting his betrayal, often using coded language to avoid direct confrontation with the regime. The rhythmic beats carried his message, bypassing censorship and igniting a sense of collective memory. The true catalyst for his domestic revival was the popular uprising of October 2014, which finally toppled Blaise Compaoré after 27 years in power. This youth-driven revolution, often referred to as the Burkinabe Spring, saw protesters openly carrying portraits of Sankara, chanting his name, and invoking his ideals of justice and uprightness. His ghost, long suppressed, had finally returned to demand accountability. The fall of Compaoré was, in many ways, the ultimate vindication of Sankara's legacy. The people had finally reclaimed their land of upright people. With the oppressive shadow of Compaoré lifted, one of the most significant demands of the newly liberated Burkinabe people was justice for Thomas Sankara. This led to the highly anticipated reopening of the investigation into his death. For years, Compaoré's regime had obstructed any attempts to uncover the truth, claiming the files were lost or refusing to cooperate. Now, with the new transitional government, the legal barriers were removed. The renewed investigation was a painstaking process, involving exhumation of Sankara's alleged remains, though their identification remained a subject of intense scientific and public debate, forensic analysis, and the collection of long-suppressed testimonies. International experts were brought in, and the quest for justice became a symbolic act of national healing. While the legal proceedings would be lengthy and complex, facing challenges of evidence and political sensitivities, the very act of reopening the investigation was a testament to the enduring power of Sankara's memory and the unyielding demand of his people for truth and accountability. The legend was no longer buried. He was resurrected, a guiding star for a new generation determined to build a truly upright Burkina Faso. Chapter 15. Was Sankara left behind? The dust has settled on the revolution, and the silence that followed Sankara's death has been broken by the clamor for justice and the reevaluation of his legacy. Decades after his assassination, Thomas Sankara remains a potent, almost mythical figure, not just in Burkina Faso but across Africa and among global activists. Yet, to truly understand what he left behind, we must move beyond hagiography and confront the complexities of his short, fiery tenure. Sankara left behind a tapestry of unfinished dreams and profound lessons that modern Africa can still learn. His vision of a self-reliant, dignified continent, free from the shackles of debt and neocolonialism, remains profoundly relevant. In an era where many African nations still grapple with economic dependency, resource exploitation by foreign powers, and the burdens of structural adjustment, Sankara's audacious rejection of foreign aid and his insistence on counting on our own forces offers a radical blueprint for development. His environmental foresight, anticipating the perils of desertification and climate change long before they became global emergencies, serves as a powerful reminder of the urgency of sustainable practices. Most importantly, his commitment to social justice, particularly the revolutionary strides for women's rights, mass literacy, and public health, highlights the transformative power of a state truly dedicated to its people's welfare, even with limited resources. He demonstrated that true liberation is not merely political independence, but economic autonomy and social equity. However, to cast Sankara solely as a faultless hero would be to miss the nuances of his legacy and the harsh realities of his revolution. He was a symbol, not a saint, a figure defined by both his brilliance and his flaws. His charisma and integrity were undeniable, but his methods were not without controversy. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, while initially conceived as instruments of popular participation, sometimes devolved into instruments of local coercion and human rights abuses, alienating segments of the population. His intolerance for dissent, while understandable in a revolutionary context facing powerful enemies, occasionally led to authoritarian tendencies. He was a man in a hurry, attempting to fundamentally transform a deeply entrenched society in a few short years, a pace that inevitably created friction and resistance. His uncompromising stance, while morally admirable, could also be seen as politically isolating, making him vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. His brilliance lay in his vision and integrity, his flaws perhaps in his impatience and occasional rigid adherence to principles in the face of complex political realities. Ultimately, Sankara's most enduring legacy is the power of one man's integrity in a corrupt world. In a continent often plagued by leaders who prioritize personal enrichment over public service, Sankara's ascetic lifestyle, his rejection of luxury, and his unwavering commitment to his people struck a chord that resonates to this day. He showed that it was possible for an African leader to be different, to prioritize the poor, to challenge the powerful, and to live by the values he preached. His integrity was his greatest strength, and perhaps also, paradoxically, a factor in his downfall, as it made him an uncompromising enemy to those who thrived on corruption. The ongoing legal investigation into his assassination, the statues erected in his honor, the music that celebrates his name, and the continuing debates about his ideas are all testaments to this enduring power. Thomas Sankara, the son of Yako, the revolutionary who renamed his nation, continues to inspire generations who seek justice, self-determination, and a better Africa. His dream remains unfinished, a challenge to current and future leaders to pick up the torch of integrity and continue the struggle for a truly liberated and upright continent. His ghost, finally free from the shadows, continues to walk the land of upright people, a constant reminder of what is possible when a leader truly serves the people.